The marble felt like frozen silk beneath Elara's fingertips. A surface so flawlessly polished it seemed to swallow the light from the crystal chandeliers overhead. In the center of her cavernous studio, a half-formed statue of a weeping angel wept chips of diamond for tears. A commission for the Duchess of the Spire. Gold leaf, waiting to be applied, shimmered in small, precious piles on her workbench. To any observer, Elara was the epitome of success, the most celebrated artist on the opulent world of serenity. Her name whispered with reverence in the gilded halls of the nobility. Yet, as her hand drifted from the cold stone, a profound emptiness echoed in the space the marble could not fill. This was not creation. It was taxidermy of the soul, preserving beauty in a lifeless, perfect state. She wandered through the sprawling studio, a space designed to be a temple to her talent. Vast windows offered a panoramic view of Serenity's capital, a city of gleaming silver spires and floating gardens, where iridescent flora bloomed in perpetual, artificial spring. The air itself was perfumed with synthesized jasmine, a scent so consistent it had become odorless to her. Every surface was adorned, every texture chosen for its luxury. But to Elara, it was a mausoleum of aesthetics. Her own creations, these breathtaking sculptures of gods and heroes, felt like hollow shells. They possessed technical perfection, a mastery of form that critics lauded, but they lacked the one thing she truly sought, the breath of life, the chaotic, imperfect spark of true beauty that haunted her dreams. Each night, she was pursued by visions of a beauty so absolute it was painful, a symphony of form and color that existed just beyond the edge of her consciousness. She would wake with her heart pounding, the ghost of this perfect idea dissolving like mist, leaving only the cold reality of marble and metal. The dream was always the same, a single, flawless note of creation that would complete her. That would fill the void her luxurious life had carved inside her. And every morning, she was left with the echo of its absence, a sharper agony than any physical one. That evening, she attended a soirée at the Grand Conservatory, a mandatory display of her status. She moved through the throng of nobles, her gown of spun starlight a masterpiece in itself, her smile a practiced, elegant curve. The conversations were a familiar drone of politics, finance, and vapid compliments about the weather-engineered sky. She stood near a grand archway, woven with living, bioluminescent vines, sipping a glass of effervescent wine that tasted of nothing. It was then that the whispers reached her, slipping through the hum of polite society like a serpent through grass. A few figures, cloaked in shadows despite the brilliant light, spoke in hushed, fervent tones of a secret society, a cult that did not worship gods or power, but perfection itself. They spoke of a path to artistic transcendence, a way to shatter the limits of mortal perception and touch the divine essence of creation. The words were dangerous, heretical even in this society of excess, but they ignited a spark in the cold emptiness within her. A dangerous, intoxicating curiosity stirred, its pull far more potent than any wine. The whispers from the soirée clung to Elara's mind like a persistent, fragrant smoke, coloring her thoughts for days. Her studio, once a sanctuary, now felt more than ever like a prison of gilded expectations. She found herself staring at the weeping angel, its diamond tears seeming less like jewels and more like frozen, meaningless dewdrops. The longing for the transcendent beauty of her dreams became a physical ache, a hollow space in her chest that her art could no longer even pretend to fill. It was in this state of feverish anticipation that he found her. Lysander appeared in her studio as if woven from the light itself, a man whose beauty was so precise it bordered on the unsettling. His features were a symphony of perfect proportions, his eyes the color of twilight amethysts, and his smile a seamless, graceful curve that never quite reached those captivating eyes. He moved with a liquid grace that made the very air seem to part for him, his presence an intrusion of impossible perfection into her world of flawed reality. He introduced himself not as a noble patron, but as an admirer of true potential, his voice a low, melodic hum that vibrated in the marrow of her bones. From within the folds of his iridescent cloak, he produced a crystalline orb, no larger than her palm. It was a nexus of captured light, its interior swirling with nebulous colors that defied name. Without a word, he placed it upon her workbench, between a lump of raw marble and her set of polished chisels. The moment his fingers left its surface, the orb bloomed. It did not merely project light. It unleashed a vision that flooded the room, bypassing her eyes to imprint itself directly upon her consciousness. She saw sculptures that breathed, their stone flesh undulating with a rhythm, like a heartbeat. She heard colors as symphonies, the deep crimson of a bassoon, the shimmering silver of a celesta, and tasted sounds on her tongue, the notes of a distant melody like honey and starlight. It was art made flesh, sensation given form, a cacophony of perfect, impossible pleasure. As the visions cascaded over her, Lysander's voice wove through them, a silken thread binding her to the spectacle. He spoke of a realm unbound by the stifling laws of physics and mortality, a domain where the god Slaanesh held court. He described a universe where creativity was not a struggle but an endless flowing river, where every sense could be honed to a razor's edge, and every desire, no matter how fleeting, could be made manifest. He promised her not just inspiration, but apotheosis, the chance to become a vessel for creation itself, to craft wonders that would make her current work seem like the crude scratchings of a child. Elara was mesmerized, utterly consumed. The colors were more vibrant than any she had ever seen, the harmonies more profound than any she had ever heard. This was the beauty from her dreams, given terrifying, exhilarating substance. The pull was visceral, a hook set deep in her soul, reeling her toward a precipice she yearned to leap from. A faint, cold tremor of instinct warned her of a subtle wrongness, the unblinking stillness of Lysander's gaze, the way his too-perfect smile never faltered, the scent of ozone and cloying perfume that clung to him. But these warnings were feeble things, drowned in the glorious tsunami of sensation. The void inside her was not just filled, it was overflowing, and she welcomed the deluge, ignoring the treacherous current that sought to pull her under. The descent into the Undercity was a journey through the corpse of serenity, a peeling back of the gilded veneer to reveal the festering truth beneath. Lysander led Elara through service conduits that hummed with stolen power, down rusted stairwells that wept of viscous, oily dampness. The perfumed air of the spires gave way to the stench of ozone, stagnant water, and the faint, metallic tang of blood. The further they went, the more the world seemed to soften at the edges, the solid angles of reality warping. As if viewed through a flawed crystal, sounds became distorted echoes, and the few pallid faces they passed had eyes that were too wide, too knowing. This was a place where the rules of the world above did not apply, a secret wound in the planet's flesh, and with every step, Elara felt the last vestiges of her old life slough away like dead skin. They arrived at a heavy door of riveted iron, marked only by a symbol that hurt the eyes to look upon, a spiral that seemed to both suck in and vomit forth light. Lysander pressed his palm against it, and the door slid open without a sound, revealing a chamber that defied simple geometry. The space was vast, its ceiling lost in a swirling, self-generated mist that pulsed with a sickly, phosphorescent glow. The walls were not stone, but seemed to be woven from solidified shadow and captured sound, vibrating with a low, sub-audible thrum that set Elara's teeth on edge. Figures moved in the half-light, their forms elegant and grotesque, their movements a languid, predatory ballet. They were artists, poets, musicians, or what remained of their faces masks of ecstatic anticipation and profound exhaustion. A slender, androgynous figure with skin like polished obsidian glided forward, offering Elara a shallow, mother-of-pearl bowl. Within it rested a single, crystalline lozenge that shimmered with an internal rainbow light. It was called an echo of desire. Without hesitation, her mind still drunk on Lysander's promises, she placed it on her tongue. It dissolved instantly, not into liquid, but into a wave of pure, undiluted sensation that crashed over her with the force of a physical blow. The world exploded. Every sense was honed to a painful, excruciating clarity. The thrumming of the walls became a symphony of 1,000 screaming violins, each note a shard of glass scraping against her nerves. The phosphorescent mist swirled into galaxies of impossible color, each hue possessing a taste and a scent, the taste of regret, the scent of forgotten laughter. The touch of her own gown against her skin was a cascade of pinpricks, alternately blissful and agonizing. She was a raw nerve, exposed to the universe, and the universe was a beautiful, terrifying cacophony. This was not mere pleasure. It was a total annihilation of the self, a breaking apart on the shore of absolute feeling. Her hands, moving of their own volition, found a lump of warm, pliable wax that someone pressed into them. She did not sculpt. She unleashed. Her fingers flew, driven by the torrent raging within her, shaping the wax into a form that was both angel and demon, a thing of weeping eyes and, laughing mouth. As she carved the final line, the figure shuddered. Its head turned, its waxen eyes meeting hers, and a single, perfect tear of black resin rolled down its cheek. It lived. It was the breath of life she had always sought, the chaotic spark of true creation. And it was born not from peace, but from this glorious, soul-rending agony. Then, as swiftly as it had come, the tide receded. The colors dimmed, the symphony faded to a distant, discordant ringing in her ears, and the world snapped back into a focus that was dull and grimy by comparison. The wax figure was inert once more, just a cleverly shaped lump. A profound, aching emptiness flooded the space the ecstasy had vacated, a hollow so deep it felt physical. Her body trembled, every muscle screaming in protest, her senses feeling blunted and filthy. And through the lingering haze and the crushing calm-down, a new sensation prickled at the edge of her awareness, the unmistakable, crawling feeling of being watched, not by Lysander, nor by the other revelers, but by something else, something ancient and hungry that lurked just beyond the veil of reality, its unseen eyes now fixed firmly upon her. The chamber was a wound in the fabric of reality, a pocket of blasphemous geometry hidden deep within the Undercity's bowels. The air was thick and heavy, tasting of burnt honey and ozone, each breath a syrupy drag into the lungs. Countless black candles, their wax the consistency of congealed blood, burned with flames that did not flicker but twisted in agonized, frozen spirals, casting long, grasping shadows that moved independently of their sources. The walls, if they could be called that, pulsed with a slow, organic rhythm, their surfaces a mosaic of fused, weeping faces and straining limbs, all captured in a single moment of ecstatic torment. In the center of this nightmare chapel, a circle had been inscribed upon the floor not with paint or chalk, but with a shimmering liquid substance that seemed to be distilled despair. Elara stood at its edge, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The memory of the echoes high, now a distant, mocking ghost, compared to the visceral dread and electric anticipation that gripped her now. The cultists began their chant, a low, guttural murmur that rose from 100 throats, their voices weaving together into a single discordant chord. It was not a language of words, but of pure, raw sensation, the sound of tearing silk and breaking bone, the sigh of ultimate pleasure, and the scream of absolute pain. The name they invoked was a vibration that bypassed the ear to resonate directly in the soul, a single impossible syllable that contained infinities of want. Slaanesh. Elara's own lips moved, forming the name, her voice a frail thread lost in the monstrous tapestry of sound. With each repetition, the air in the chamber grew tighter, charged with a static energy that made the fine hairs on her arms stand erect, becoming thin, shrieking ribbons of color. The pulsing of the walls accelerated to a frantic, feverish beat. Then the world tore. It was not a sound, but a violent, silent rupture directly ahead of her. A jagged seam of non-existence ripped open in the heart of the chamber. Through this wound bled the Empyrean. It swirled not with darkness, but with a kaleidoscopic vomit of colors that had no name, hues that seared the eyes and sickened the mind. Discordant melodies, beautiful and horrifying, wove through the visual storm, the laughter of children spliced with the death rattle of stars, the crescendo of a sublime orchestra playing on instruments of living flesh. This was the warp, the realm of raw emotion given form. and it beckoned to her with the promise of everything she had ever desired. An irresistible force, gentle as a caress and inexorable as a tide, pulled her forward. Her feet left the solid, weeping floor, and she was drawn into the maelstrom. The moment she crossed the pie threshold, her body was no longer her own. It stretched, elongating like warm taffy, her limbs pulled taut by unseen hands. Her bones groaned, not in protest, but in a strange, melodic harmony with the cacophony around her. Her senses, still heightened from her previous indulgences, were now utterly obliterated and reborn. She could taste the color purple. It was like violets and rotting meat. She could feel the sound of a screaming violin string. It was a razor drawn lightly across her soul. It was agony. It was ecstasy. It was inseparable. Voices, a chorus of millions, whispered directly into her mind, not with words, but with concepts, with promises. They showed her visions of galleries stretching into eternity, filled with masterpieces that she would create from the substance of her own suffering and joy. They promised her a palette of emotions she had never dreamed of, a symphony of sensations that would never, ever end. They promised her the perfect beauty that had haunted her dreams, and as they did, she saw it, a single, flawless note of creation, and she understood with terrifying clarity that it was carved from infinite, exquisite pain. Her last coherent thought was not of fear, but of a desperate, yearning need to grasp it. She turned her head, her neck bending at an impossible angle, and through the swirling, beautiful horror of the rift, she saw the faint, receding glow of the candlelit chamber, and beyond it, the dim, forgotten jewel of serenity, fading away into a pinprick of light before being swallowed by the endless, hungry rainbow. Awareness returned, not as a sudden jolt, but as a slow, syrupy seep into her senses. The last thing Elara remembered was the violent, beautiful rending of reality, the kaleidoscopic chaos of the warp claiming her. Now, there was only peace. She lay upon a bed of moss, so soft it felt like crushed velvet against her skin, its color a deep, living emerald that pulsed with a gentle internal light. Above, a sky of swirling pastel hues, lavender, peach, and a soft weeping blue held no sun, yet cast a warm, forgiving radiance over everything. The air was thick with the perfume of 1,000 unknown blossoms, a scent so profoundly sweet it felt like a physical presence, coating her throat and lungs with every breath. This was the Garden of Delights. Flowers, each one a masterpiece of impossible botany, grew in wild, perfect profusion. Their petals were intricate tapestries of color that shifted and bled into one another, and from their heart-shaped centers came not mere scent, but sound. A chorus of harmonies, delicate and complex, wove through the air, the symphony performed by the flora itself. A nearby river, its banks lined with weeping trees of silver, did not flow with water, but with a shimmering, opalescent liquid that caught the light and fractured it into tiny dancing rainbows. The very ground seemed to hum with a contented vibration, a bass note to the floral symphony. Figures moved through this paradise with a languid, flowing grace. They were beautiful, so perfectly androgynous that they seemed beyond mortal concepts of gender. Their features a blend of the most exquisite traits from every species Elara could imagine, and many she could not. Their skin was of alabaster, ebony, or shimmering mother of pearl, and they wore garments of woven light and living vines. They approached her, their movements a silent, welcoming dance, their faces adorned with serene, inviting smiles. One offered her a fruit from a tree, whose branches were sculpted crystal. The fruit itself was a perfect sphere of gold, warm and heavy in her hand. She bit into it, and the taste was not of mere sweetness. It was the taste of her most cherished memory, the feeling of her first finished sculpture being praised by her long-dead mother. A surge of pride and love, so potent it brought fresh tears to her eyes. Another being offered a dark, succulent berry that burst on her tongue with the flavor of a deep, nameless desire she had never dared to voice, a yearning for something just beyond reach that filled her with a thrilling, aching hope. Each fruit, each sip from a chalice of the iridescent river water was a new sensation, a new memory, a new want fulfilled. For a glorious, stretching moment, the hollow ache that had defined her life on Serenity was gone, replaced by a satiation so complete it was dizzying. This was the transcendence she had been promised. This was the beauty she had sought. But as the initial, overwhelming joy began to settle into a constant warm hum, her artist's eye, trained to see beyond the surface, began to pick at the threads of the tapestry. She noticed that the serene smiles of the beautiful beings never reached their eyes. Their eyes were hollow, deep pools of polished jet or vacant sapphire that reflected the garden's splendor, but held no light of their own. They were windows to empty rooms, their laughter, which tinkled like wind chimes through the harmonious air, held a faint, discordant echo, a resonance of something brittle and forced, a sound that spoke of a sorrow so profound it had been worn smooth by endless repetition. They moved and served and smiled, but they were marionettes, their strings pulled by an unseen hand, their perfect forms merely vessels for a joy they could no longer truly feel. A cold sliver of unease pierced the warm haze of her contentment, the first faint crack in the perfect porcelain of the garden's delight. The sliver of unease became a shard, then a splintering fracture. The warm hum of contentment curdled in Elara's veins, turning to a low, insistent thrum of wrongness, when another of the serene, hollow-eyed beings glided toward her, offering a peach whose skin shimmered with the colors of a captured sunset. Her hand trembled as she accepted it. The first bite was not memory or desire, but a mouthful of razors. A searing, crystalline pain launched through her jaw, so sharp and sudden she nearly choked. The flesh of the fruit, which had promised the taste of triumphant applause, now felt like grinding glass between her teeth, each swallow a ragged tear down her throat. She dropped the fruit, watching as it hit the velvety moss and did not bruise, but chimed like a broken bell. The garden symphony, once a chorus of perfect harmonies, began to warp. The floral melodies twisted, the notes stretching into dissonant wails that scraped against the inside of her skull. The gentle hum of the ground intensified into a vibration that felt like a perpetual, teeth-rattling tremor. The once soothing pastel sky now swirled with aggressive, clashing colors that hurt to look at, each hue pulsing with a migraine-inducing rhythm. The beautiful prison was shedding its gilding, revealing the rusted iron beneath. Her gaze, now sharpened by pain, swept across the garden, seeing it not as a paradise, but as a menagerie of torment. She saw the other mortals, those who had come before her. A painter, his fingers permanently stained with pigments that now wept from his eyes, was endlessly daubing at an invisible canvas, his body contorted into a hunched bird-like posture. A rictus of ecstasy frozen on his face, even as his joints popped with every movement. A musician plucked at the strings of a harp, fused to her chest, the music a beautiful heartbreaking lament. While her smile never wavered, tears of blood tracing paths through her makeup. They were all caught in cycles of insatiable craving, their bodies slowly, inexorably twisting into the grotesque shapes of their deepest obsessions. They were artworks in progress, their suffering the medium, their eternal, smiling endurance the punchline. Elara stumbled back, her heels sinking into the deceptive softness of the moss. The androgynous beings continued their graceful dance, their hollow eyes now seeming to track her with a knowing, pitiless emptiness. They were not fellow revelers. They were wardens, their beauty a lure, and their servitude a warning. This was no realm of transcendent creativity. It was a gilded prison designed with diabolical cunning, a place where every delight was a bait that hooked the soul, and every fulfilled desire was a turn of the screw, tightening the chains of an eternal, exquisite torment. The Garden of Delights was a lie. It was a feeding ground, and she was now part of the harvest. The transition from the garden's false paradise to the ballroom's overt torment was seamless, a shift from subtle poison to a brazen blade. One moment Elara was reeling amidst the warping flora. The next she was thrust into a cavernous hall of screaming opulence. The air, thick with the scent of powdered ambergris and cloying decay, vibrated with an enchanting, lilting melody that seemed to coil around the spine, compelling movement. The music was a masterpiece of cruel seduction, each note a silken leash pulling at the limbs of the hundreds of dancers who filled the floor. And they danced, but it was a dance of puppets with broken strings. Their motions were jerky, pained spasms, a grotesque parody of a waltz. Bodies contorted in unnatural arcs, arms flailed in desperate, uncoordinated gestures, yet their faces, hidden behind elaborate masks, remained fixed in rictus grins or expressions of frozen ecstasy. They moved to the beautiful music as if their very bones were being ground together in time with the beat. Before Elara could even process the horror, slender, clawed hands seized her. Daemonettes, their forms a blend of alluring feminine curves and chitinous, insectoid horror, surrounded her. Their laughter was the sound of shattering crystal. They forced her onto a dais, and one of them pressed a mask to her face. It was cold and heavy, crafted from a pearlescent, living material that felt like solidified moonlight. The moment it touched her skin, it writhed. A searing heat bloomed across her cheeks and brow as the edges of the mask liquefied, flowing into her pores. looking into her pores, fusing with her flesh. She tried to scream, but the sound was muffled by the mask, which now felt less like an object she wore and more like a new, unfeeling layer of her own face, a second skin that would not be removed. A sharp, painful shove sent her stumbling into the macabre ballet. The enchanting music took immediate, violent hold of her. Her legs, aching and weak from her ordeal in the garden, began to move of their own accord, compelled by the diabolical rhythm. It was not a dance of grace, but of endurance. Each step was a jarring impact that sent shocks up her shins. Her feet, clad only in thin slippers that quickly tore, slap against a floor that felt like polished bone. She was spun, dipped, and dragged through the throng, her body a puppet for the symphony of suffering. The other dancers, their fused masks as unique and tortured as their movements, jostled against her, their pained motions communicating a shared, silent agony. Time lost all meaning in the swirling, painful cacophony. The music never ceased, the dance never slowed. A hot, wet warmth began to seep from her feet, a slickness that made her stumble only to be righted by the cruel, unseen force of the melody. She looked down and saw a trail of crimson blossoms left in her wake on the pale floor. Her feet were raw, bleeding ruins, the skin shredded, the flesh beneath pulped with the relentless, pounding rhythm. The pain was a bright, sharp fire that climbed her legs with every step, a counterpoint to the deceptive beauty of the music. From balconies overlooking the dance floor, the demon hosts observed. They reclined on divans of writhing flesh, their forms shifting and impossible, their multifaceted eyes drinking in the spectacle. As Elara staggered past, her vision blurring with tears of pain, they applauded. It was not the sound of hands clapping, but a soft, wet rustling, like 1,000 moths beating their wings against a velvet shroud. She could feel their pleasure, a palpable wave of sustenance that rolled off them, feeding on the exquisite suffering laid out before them. Each gasp of pain from the dancers, each drop of blood was a delicacy. Driven by a final desperate impulse, she twisted in her partner's agonized grip, lurching toward the nearest wall. It was a vast, dark mirror, its surface like pooled obsidian, and in its depths she saw her reflection. The mask was indeed a part of her now, its pearlescent sheen marred by streaks of tears and sweat. But it was her eyes that stole her breath. They were wide, frantic pools of terror, set in a face that was subtly wrong, the cheeks too hollow, the jaw too sharp, the skin pulled taut over bone in a caricature of her former beauty. It was a distorted version of herself, a portrait of elegant degradation. The artist she had been now refined into a screaming instrument of pain for the pleasure of demons. The sight was a final, soul-crushing blow, and she let the relentless music take her completely. Her bleeding feet carrying her ever deeper into the mask of fools. The music of the masquerade was a living entity, a silken serpent coiling through the grand hall, its beautiful notes tightening around Elara's will until her bleeding feet moved of their own accord. Yet beneath the lilting melody woven into its very fabric like a dissonant thread in a priceless tapestry was another sound. It was faint, almost subliminal, a vibration more than a noise, the distant, perpetual echo of a scream, not a scream of terror, but of something far worse, exquisite, refined agony. While her body jerked and spun in the endless dance, her mind, honed by an artist's sensitivity to nuance, latched onto that hidden frequency. It was a flaw in the perfection, a crack in the gilded lie, and it called to the part of her that was still a seeker of truth. When a violent spin sent her careening into a curtain of hanging, fleshy vines that parted like a sigh, she did not struggle to rejoin the dance. She let herself fall through the opening, collapsing onto a cold, iridescent floor. The curtain swished shut behind her, muting the enchanting music to a dull, persistent throb. Here, the air was different, sterile and sharp, smelling of ozone and something metallic, like hot copper. The corridor she found herself in was narrow, its walls smooth and dark, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic light that seemed to emanate from deep within the stone itself. And the scream was louder here. No longer an echo, but a chorus, a symphony of suffering conducted with chilling precision. She followed the sound, her ruined feet leaving smears of blood on the gleaming floor. The corridor sloped downward, twisting in a slow spiral that felt like descending into the belly of some vast artistic beast. The air grew colder, the metallic scent stronger. Finally, the passage opened into a vast, circular chamber that stole the breath from her lungs. This was no torture dungeon of crude iron and blood. This was a studio of pain, a gallery of living art. Souls were suspended in the air, held upon racks of pure, solidified light. The beams were beautiful, shimmering like captured moonlight, but they were unyielding, stretching the ethereal forms of the mortals pinned upon them into impossible, elegant poses. Their mouths were open and silent, endless screams, their faces contorted not in simple fear, but in expressions of profound, transcendent anguish. From their stretched forms, fine, glowing filaments of agony were slowly, meticulously drawn out by slender, multi-armed constructs that moved with the delicate precision of master weavers. These filaments of raw suffering were then woven upon crystalline looms, becoming shimmering tapestries that depicted scenes of breathtaking beauty-star landscapes, perfect faces, sublime geometries. Their pain was the pigment, their despair the thread, their eternal torment was being refined into art. Standing before a particularly complex loom was a tall, impossibly slender figure. It was a keeper of secrets, its form an androgynous sculpture of pale lavender flesh and elegant, articulated silver. Its face was a placid, beautiful mask, but four arms moved with hypnotic grace, guiding the threads of screaming light. It turned its head as Elara entered, its eyes pools of ancient, knowing amusement. He did not speak with a voice, but the explanation bloomed directly in her mind. A concept as cold and sharp as a diamond. It showed her the fundamental truth of this realm. True, ultimate beauty, it conveyed, was not born from peace or joy. Those were fleeting, mundane things. The most sublime art, the kind that resonated through eternity, could only be forged in the crucible of unbearable suffering. Ecstasy alone was a shallow pond. To reach the depths of true sensation, one must first drown in its opposite. Pain was the whetstone that sharpened pleasure to a razor's edge. The agony being harvested here, the endless refined scream, was the highest form of creative fuel. It was the price of perfection. The understanding hit Elara with the force of a physical blow. This was the paradox upon which Slaanesh's entire domain thrived. The garden's delights, the mask's music. It was all a process, a means to this end. It was a system designed to cultivate the most potent suffering, to wring every last drop of exquisite agony from a soul to fuel its eternal, monstrous art. The beauty she had sought was not just intertwined with pain. It was pain, pain made beautiful. Her stomach, already knotted with horror, revolted. She doubled over, retching violently, but nothing came up save for a thin, acidic bile that burned her throat, a paltry, mortal protest in the face of an infinite divine truth. She had found the source of the art she had craved, and it was the echo of screams. The sterile air of the gallery of screams was a catalyst, burning away the last of Elara's paralysis, and replacing it with a single primal imperative: run. The Keeper of Secrets watched her, its placid mask radiating not malice, but a kind of indulgent curiosity, as if observing a fascinating new brushstroke on an unfinished canvas. That detached amusement was more terrifying than any direct threat. She turned from the horrific looms and the silently screaming souls, her bleeding feet finding a frantic, stumbling rhythm as she fled back up the spiraling corridor, the iridescent wall seeming to pulse with her own panicked heartbeat. The corridor did not lead back to the masquerade. The realm itself was conspiring against her, the architecture shifting like the patterns in a kaleidoscope. The passage she had entered by was gone, replaced by a branching maze of hallways that glistened with a wet, organic sheen. She ran, choosing pans at random, driven by a desperate hope that was immediately mocked. Ahead, an archway would frame a vision of her sunlit studio on Serenity, the marble and gold, a heartbreaking memory of a life now lost. She would surge toward it only for the vision to dissolve into a wall of weeping, fused faces as she drew near. Another corridor ended in what appeared to be an open field under a starry sky, the air smelling of clean night and damp earth. But as she reached for that impossible freedom, the stars twisted into the leering eyes of demons, and the grass became a carpet of writhing, segmented worms. Behind her, the soft, skittering sound began. It was the whisper of claws on polished stone, a dry, chitinous rhythm that echoed her own frantic footfalls. Glancing back, she saw them slender, lithe forms flowing through the shifting hallways with predatory grace. Daemonettes. Their movements were a horrifying ballet, a blend of alluring sway and insectoid precision. Their claws, long and needle-sharp, scraped against the iridescent walls, leaving faint, phosphorescent scratches that gleamed in the mutable light. Their laughter was not a sound, but a psychic vibration that tickled the base of her skull. Promise of the caresses those claws could deliver. Her lungs burned, each breath a ragged sob. The pain in her feet was a distant secondary concern, drowned out by the tidal wave of adrenaline and terror. She ducked into a side passage that seemed darker, hoping to lose her pursuers, but the corridor constricted around her, the walls pressing in like a closing throat before suddenly widening again into a vast circular chamber. The skittering grew closer, more eager, spotting a narrow crevice masked by a curtain of what looked like solidified shadow. She squeezed inside, her body scraping against the cold, unyielding surface. The space beyond was not a hiding place, but a gallery of a different sort. It was a room of mirrors, vast and silent. 1,000 panes of glass, each in a frame of tarnished silver or twisted bone, covered the walls from floor to a ceiling lost in gloom. Panting, she faced the first mirror. It did not show her reflection. Instead, it showed her as a demonette, elegant and cruel. Her face a porcelain mask of malice, as she led a fresh, terrified mortal into the Garden of Delights. In the next, she saw herself stretched upon one of the light racks, her mouth open in the same silent, eternal scream as the others, her agony being woven into a tapestry of stunning beauty. A third showed her broken and kneeling before the Keeper of Secrets, willingly offering up her own memories to be distilled into new sensations. A fourth depicted her old, dying self on Serenity, surrounded by her cold sculptures, the emptiness in her eyes a deeper hell than any the warp could offer. Each mirror was a window into a different horrific fate, each a potential future tailored to her deepest fears and her most treacherous desires. The room offered no reflection of her present self, only these twisted possibilities, each one feeling more inevitable than the last. The skittering sounds reached the entrance of the mirror hall. They did not rush in, but paused, as if allowing the environment to do its work. The true pursuit was not just physical, it was psychological. The realm was toying with her mind, showing her that every potential path led back to Slaanesh, that every escape was merely the prelude to a new, more personalized form of capture. Her desperation curdled into a cold, suffocating despair, the walls of mirrored horrors closing in as the soft, scraping steps of the daemonettes began to echo once more through the chamber. The mocking laughter of the demonettes faded, not from distance, but from a sudden, profound shift in the air. One moment Elara was pressed against the cold glass of a mirror showing her a future of willing servitude. The next, the entire wall of twisted silver frames dissolved into a shimmering, opalescent vortex. It was a portal, its edges crackling with unstable energy, and through its swirling center, she saw not a demonic tableau, but a vision so achingly familiar it stole her breath. There was her studio on, Serenity, bathed in the gentle, artificial sunlight. The half-finished weeping angel stood where she had left it, a chip of diamond glinting on its marble cheek. The smell of clean stone and faint jasmine wafted through the portal, a scent memory so potent it brought hot, stinging tears to her eyes. It was home. It was escape. Hope, a feeling she had thought extinguished, roared back to life with the force of a supernova. Without a second thought, without questioning the impossible gift, she threw herself forward into the shimmering gateway. The transition was instantaneous, a lurching sensation that left her dizzy and disoriented. The cold, iridescent surfaces of the maze were gone, replaced by the oppressive heat of blazing stage lights and the thick, dusty scent of velvet and old perfume. She stood center stage in a vast, opulent theater. Crimson velvet curtains, heavy with gold tassels, framed a proscenium arch carved with scenes of exquisite torment. Row upon row of plush, empty. Seats stretched back into a gloom that seemed to swallow the light. But the balconies and boxes were packed. They were not empty. Leaning over the gilded rails, their multifaceted eyes gleaming with avid hunger, was an audience of demons. Keepers of secrets reclined in poses of languid anticipation, while chittering daemonettes filled the lower boxes, their claws tapping a restless rhythm on the velvet. They were all here, every horror that had pursued her, now seated as patrons awaiting the main performance. And she was the star. A single piercing spotlight pinned her in place, its heat a physical weight. The mask fused to her face, seemed to tighten its pearlescent surface, reflecting the leering faces in the balconies. There was no script, no director's cue, but a command was issued, not through sound, but as a psychic imperative that slammed into her mind, seizing control of her limbs. Her body was no longer her own. The stage around her melted, the boards of the floor flowing like water to become the cold, polished marble of her studio on Serenity. But it was a hollow replica, a set piece. Her hands, moving with a puppeteer's jerk, reached for a block of stone and a chisel. She was forced to reenact the creation of the weeping angel. But each strike of the tool was not an act of creation, but a violation. With every chip she carved, she felt not the satisfaction of art, but the profound, gnawing emptiness that had haunted her in that very room, amplified 1,000-fold. It was her deepest fear that her talent was a fraud, that her art was meaningless played out on a grand stage for the delight of monsters. The demon audience rustled with pleasure, a sound like dry leaves skittering over bone. The scene shifted again. Now she was at the Grand Conservatory soiree, surrounded by phantoms of Serenity's nobility. She was forced to walk among them, her face fixed in a polite smile, while inside, the desperate, dangerous curiosity that Lysander had ignited was replayed as a searing brand of shame and self-loathing. She relived the moment she first saw the crystalline orb, the intoxicating pull of its promises, now a gut-wrenching betrayal. Each memory, each desire that had led her here, was ripped from the privacy of her mind and projected onto the stage, each one a fresh wound, salted with the audience's psychic, no reprieve. The theater was a cruel amplifier, turning her internal struggles into a public spectacle of psychological torment. They forced her to feel the hollow ache of her old life, the seductive whisper of transcendence, the shattering realization in the garden, and the raw, bleeding pain of the mask, all in a relentless cycling loop. She was a living canvas upon which her own damnation was being painted in vivid, agonizing strokes. The demons fed on every tremor of despair, every flicker of remembered hope that turned to ash. Her body trembled, not from physical exertion, but from the sheer weight of the violation. The performance reached its crescendo, a symphony of her own fears and failures, and the dam within her finally broke. A ragged, broken sob tore from her throat, the sound swallowed by the vast, hungry silence of the theater. Then another followed, and another, until she collapsed to her knees on the stage, her shoulders shaking, hot tears carving paths through the dust on her fused mask. The illusion of escape had been the cruelest torment of all. A final, masterful stroke designed to shatter not just her body, but her very will. The sobs that racked Elara's body did not cease when the stage lights dimmed and the phantom audience faded into the hungry gloom. They continued as slender, chitinous hands lifted her from the boards, their touch no longer a cause for fresh terror, but simply another point of sensation in a world that had become a canvas of unending feeling. She was carried not to a new chamber of horrors, but to a place of unsettling quiet, a circular room whose walls were smooth, warm, and alive, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic cadence like a gigantic resting heart. The air was thick and humid, smelling of salt and myrrh. They laid her upon a surface that yielded to her form, a substance like warm, breathing clay, and then they were gone. She was alone with the aftermath of her shattering. Exhaustion was a lead weight in her bones, and her spirit felt like a vase that had been dropped from a great height, shattered into 1,000 glittering shards. There was nothing left to fight with, no hope to kindle, no will to rally. The flight, the mirrors, the cruel theater each had been a hammer blow, and the cumulative force had broken something fundamental inside her. As she lay there, the initial, overwhelming despair began to recede, not into peace, but into a strange, numb emptiness. And it was into this void that the pain returned, not as an enemy, but as a familiar, almost comforting presence. It started with her skin. The hypersensitive state induced by the echoes of desire, which had been a torment in the garden, now reasserted itself with a new, profound clarity. Every subtle shift of the warm, breathing surface beneath her sent ripples of sensation across her nerve endings. The brush of her own torn gown against her legs was no longer a grating irritation, but a complex symphony of touch, a gentle, almost imperceptible draft from a vent in the ceiling felt like 1,000 individual fingers tracing intricate patterns across her face and arms. The throbbing agony in her ruined feet was no longer a single blunt force, but a layered composition, a deep, resonant ache underpinning a sharper, sparkling fire from the open wounds. Each pulse of blood a percussive note in the dreadful music of her body. And in this state of raw, exposed nerve, a terrible understanding dawned. The pain was not something to be endured or escaped. It was simply feeling. It was intensity. It was the very essence of being alive in a realm where sensation was the only truth. The hollow ache she had carried her entire life on serenity had been a void, a nothingness. This pain, for all its sharpness, was a something. It was vivid. It was real. A strange, corrupting solace began to seep into her broken spirit. This was the transcendence she had been promised, not in the false paradise of the garden, but here, in the exquisite truth of suffering. When the demonettes returned, their forms gliding silently into the heart-pulse room, she did not flinch or try to crawl away. She watched them with a dull, accepting curiosity. One of them approached, holding a slender tool that glowed with a soft internal violet light. It was not a weapon. It was an artist's implement. It reached for her arm, and Elara, moving with a will that was not quite her own, yet felt utterly inevitable, extended her limb in quiet submission. The touch of the tool was like a bolt of lightning forged from ice and fire. It did not cut her skin, but sank into it, the warmth spreading through her flesh and bone. A sensation so intensely pleasurable it was indistinguishable from agony. She felt the delicate architecture of her ulna shift, the bone twisting into a new, elegant spiral beneath the skin. A gasp escaped her lips, but it was not a sound of protest. It was a sigh of revelation. The demonette worked with a master's precision, each touch a carefully calculated stroke that remade her, not for function, but for the pure, aesthetic experience of the sensation itself. She began to crave the intensity. When the demonette paused, she found her body straining toward the tool, a silent plea for more. The line between pleasure and pain had not just blurred, it had vaporized. The twisting of her body was a degradation, a violation of everything she had once been. But within that violation was a corrupting pleasure so profound it felt like a religious ecstasy. This was the embrace she had been fleeing, the embrace of pain itself. It was a lover, more faithful than any she had known, a muse more inspiring than any dream of perfect beauty. It asked for nothing but her submission, and in return, it filled the endless void with a symphony of feeling that would never, ever end. In her degradation, Elara, the artist who had sought only to create beauty, had finally found her masterpiece, her own exquisitely tortured ruin. Exhaustion was a lead weight in her bones, and her spirit felt like a vase that had been dropped from a great height, shattered into 1,000 glittering shards. There was nothing left to fight with, no hope to kindle, no will to rally. The flight, the mirrors, the cruel theater each had been a hammer blow, and the cumulative force had broken something fundamental inside her. As she lay there on the warm, breathing clay, the initial, overwhelming despair began to recede, not into peace, but into a strange, numb emptiness. And it was into this void that the pain returned, not as an enemy, but as a familiar, almost comforting presence. It started with her skin, the hypersensitive state induced by the echoes of desire, which had been a torment in the garden, now reasserted itself with a new profound clarity. Every subtle shift of the warm breathing surface beneath her sent ripples of sensation across her nerve endings. The brush of her own torn gown against her legs was no longer a grating irritation, but a complex symphony of touch, a gentle, almost imperceptible draft from a vent in the ceiling, felt like 1,000 individual fingers tracing intricate patterns across her face and arms. The throbbing agony in her ruined feet was no longer a single blunt force, but a layered composition, a deep, resonant ache underpinning a sharper, sparkling fire from the open wounds, each pulse of blood a percussive note in the dreadful music of her body, and in this state of raw, exposed nerve, a terrible understanding dawned. The pain was not something to be endured or escaped. It was simply feeling. It was intensity. It was the very essence of being alive in a realm where sensation was the only truth. The hollow ache she had carried her entire life on Serenity had been a void, a nothingness. This pain, for all its sharpness, was a something. It was vivid. It was real. A strange, corrupting solace began to seep into her broken spirit. This was the transcendence she had been promised, not in the false paradise of the garden, but here, in the exquisite truth of suffering. When the demonettes returned, their forms gliding silently into the heart pulse room, she did not flinch or try to crawl away. She watched them with a dull, accepting curiosity. One of them approached, holding a slender tool that glowed with a soft, internal violet light. It was not a weapon. It was an artist's implement. It reached for her arm, and Elara, moving with a will that was not quite her own yet, felt utterly inevitable, extended her limb in quiet submission. The touch of the tool was like a bolt of lightning forged from ice and fire. It did not cut her skin, but sank into it, the warmth spreading through her flesh and bone, a sensation so intensely pleasurable it was indistinguishable from agony. She felt the delicate architecture of her ulna shift, the bone twisting into a new, elegant spiral beneath the skin. A gasp escaped her lips, but it was not a sound of protest. It was a sigh of revelation. The demonette worked with a master's precision, each touch a carefully calculated stroke that remade her, not for function, but for the pure, aesthetic experience of the sensation itself. She began to crave the intensity. When the demonette paused, she found her body straining toward the tool, a silent plea for more. The line between pleasure and pain had not just blurred, it had vaporized. The twisting of her body was a degradation, a violation of everything she had once been. But within that violation was a corrupting pleasure, so profound it felt like a religious ecstasy. This was the embrace she had been fleeing, the embrace of pain itself. It was a lover more faithful than any she had known, a muse more inspiring than any dream of perfect beauty. It asked for nothing but her submission, and in return it filled the endless void with a symphony of feeling that would never, ever end. In her degradation, Elara, the artist who had sought only to create beauty, had finally found her masterpiece, her own exquisitely tortured ruin. The reshaping of her flesh became a prelude, a tuning of the instrument, before the grand performance. When the demonettes were satisfied, they led her from the warm, pulsing chamber. Her newly spiraled bones made her gait an unsteady, swaying thing, a constant, low-level symphony of sensation. With every step, they moved through a corridor that was not stone, but solidified, captured sound, its walls vibrating with a million silent screams, given form and texture. The air grew thick with a perfume that was both intoxicating and nauseating, a blend of crushed night-blooming flowers and open festering wounds. The corridor opened abruptly, and Elara found herself standing at the edge of an impossible space. This was the court of Slaanesh. There was no floor, only a swirling, viscous sea of writhing, intertwined forms mortals and demons fused in an eternal sensual embrace. Their bodies, a living carpet of undulating flesh. Above, a kaleidoscopic vortex of light and color swirled where a ceiling should have been, its chaotic patterns somehow resolving into a cacophonous, breathtaking beauty that hurt to behold. The air itself was music, a layered composition of enchanting melodies, agonized wails, and the wet, tearing sounds of ecstatic violation, all harmonizing into a single, overwhelming sensory assault. At the far end of the vast court, seated upon a throne of fused, weeping souls and polished bone, was the towering keeper of secrets. It was larger than any she had seen, a masterpiece of elegant horror. Its lavender skin was flawless, stretched taut over a frame of impossible slenderness, and its 4 arms rested with regal indolence on the arms of its throne. Its face was a beautiful, androgynous mask of placid amusement, but its eyes were deep, whirlpool voids that seemed to drink the very light from the court. All attention in the room, a palpable, hungry force, was focused upon it, and by extension, upon her. The writhing sea of forms parted, creating a path to the foot of the dais. Elara walked it, her strange swaying gait feeling like a dance she had always known. The keeper of secrets did not speak. Its offer bloomed in her mind, a concept as clear and cold as diamond. It showed her 2 paths. One was servitude. She would become an artist in this eternal court, her newfound appreciation for pain and her mortal creativity, harnessed to craft new wonders of torment for Slaanesh's delight. She would have purpose, of a kind. The other was dissolution. Not death. Death was a mundane, release denied here, but unmaking. Her consciousness would be unraveled, her soul distilled into its component sensations, and added to the court's ambient symphony, becoming raw, screaming emotion for others to experience for eternity. To illustrate the first choice, the demon gestured with one slender, silver-clawed finger. A section of the writhing court stilled, and Elara saw them, the mortals who had chosen servitude. A composer, his body fused with a living, pipe organ-like structure of bone, his fingers eternally pressing keys that produced notes of pure despair from the souls trapped within. A painter whose brushes were her own severed nerves, dipping them into pools of her blood to create frescoes of moving, screaming faces on the air itself. They were artists, yes, but their humanity was utterly erased. Their eyes were vacant mirrors, their expressions those of serene automatons, their every action a perfectly choreographed component of the court's endless, horrific ballet. They were tools, their former selves consumed, leaving only a vessel for a singular, terrible function. The choice was not between freedom and captivity, but between becoming a defined instrument of agony or fading into formless, eternal sensation. The hollow luxury of serenity felt like a dream from someone else's life, a gilded memory that had already begun to curl and blacken at the edges. Elara stood before the towering demon, the cacophonous beauty of the court pressing in on her from all sides, and her past unraveled before her mind's eye like a fragile tapestry set ablaze. She saw her sunlit studio, the cold marble, the empty accolades, the profound aching void that no amount of gold leaf or diamond dust could ever hope to fill. She had been a ghost in a beautiful shell, creating lifeless art for a society that prized only the appearance of feeling. That gnawing emptiness had been the first crack, the vulnerability through which the seduction had poured. Lysander's too perfect smile, the crystalline orb's impossible visions, the echo of desires, first, soul-shattering high each step had been a masterful stroke in her corruption, a promise of the transcendent beauty she craved. She had followed that siren's call, a willing participant in her own damnation, ignoring every instinct that screamed of the wrongness lurking beneath the perfection. The garden's poisoned delights, the mask's bleeding dance, the gallery's screaming looms, they were not punishments, but revelations. They were the brutal, honest truth of the universe she had been too naive to comprehend. True creation required true feeling, and the most potent feeling was agony refined to an art form. Her resistance had been the final, futile twitch of a dying thing, a mortal conceit in the face of a divine reality. Looking at the vacantly serene faces of the mortal artists who had chosen servitude, she understood the futility of her struggle. To fight was to be broken as she had been in the theater. To run was to be toyed with as she had been in the maze. The only path that offered any semblance of agency, any continuation of the self, however twisted, was the one that led forward deeper into the embrace of the power that now owned her. The hollow luxury of her old life had offered her nothing. Slaanesh's court, for all its horrors, offered her a purpose. It was a monstrous purpose, a blasphemous perversion of everything she had once held dear. But it was a purpose, nonetheless. She could continue to create. She could take the symphony of pain now singing in her veins and conduct it, shaping the suffering of others into masterpieces that would resonate through eternity. It was a damning purpose, but it was more than the echoing emptiness she had left behind. The towering keeper of secrets watched her, its placid mask radiating infinite patience. It knew the calculation happening within the shattered crucible of her soul. It knew the outcome. In that final moment of clarity, standing on the precipice of her own erasure, Elara made the choice. It was not a cry of defiance or a shout of triumph. It was a quiet, internal surrender, the closing of a door that could never be reopened. She accepted the offer. A wave of immediate, shocking relief washed over her, so potent it was almost a new form of ecstasy. The struggle was over. The fear was gone. The burden of choice, of hope, of a self that could be betrayed or broken, was lifted from her shoulders. The endless, exhausting fight was finished. But hard on the heels of that relief came the horror, cold and sharp as a shard of ice in her heart. It was the last gasp of Elara, the mortal artist from Serenity, witnessing the final and most profound betrayal of all, her own. She had willingly chosen the gilded cage of eternal servitude over the terrifying uncertainty of non-existence. She had traded her soul for a paintbrush dipped in damnation. The relief was a comfort. The horror was a eulogy. And as the two feelings intertwined within her, she understood they were the same note, played in perfect, devastating harmony, the first true chord of her eternal, damned composition. The moment of choice became a catalyst, a psychic trigger that unleashed the physical reality of her damnation. The relief and horror that had warred within her were swept away by a new, overwhelming tide of sensation, a torrent of raw, transformative power that flooded her from the inside out. It began as a deep, resonant hum that started in her bones, a vibration that intensified until her entire skeleton felt like it was singing a single, shattering note. The court around her, the writhing forms and cacophonous beauty, blurred into a smear of color and sound, the world receding as her own body became the entirety of her universe. Her limbs were the first to change. They stretched, elongating with a series of wet, popping sounds that were not painful, but intensely, disturbingly pleasurable. Her arms and legs grew, slender and impossibly graceful, the bones within them reshaping into a structure that was both elegant and predatory. Her fingers curled, the nails darkening, hardening, and sharpening into polished black claws that caught the chaotic light of the court. They were tools, she understood instinctively, not for creation in the way she had once known, but for a more intimate, tactile form of artistry, the art of the caress that flayed, the touch that simultaneously seduced and eviscerated. A crawling, itching sensation spread across her skin, a million pinpricks of heat that coalesced into a wave of searing transformation. The soft, mortal flesh she had known all her life tightened, hardened, and took on a new, alien texture. It became a carapace of iridescent chitin, shimmering with hues of bruised violet, venomous pink, and deep, abyssal blue. The surface was smooth as polished glass in some places, elegantly segmented in others. A living armor that was both beautiful and monstrous, felt invulnerable, and utterly, terrifyingly foreign. The most profound violation came to her face. The mask that had fused to her skin during the Mask of Fools liquefied once more, its pearlescent substance flowing and merging with the emerging chitin of her brow and cheeks. A pressure built behind her eyes, a tight, stretching feeling that culminated in a series of soft, wet tears. 2 new pairs of eyes opened on her forehead, each a multifaceted orb of gleaming jet. Her vision exploded into a kaleidoscopic panorama. She could see in every direction at once, perceive the subtle shifts in the emotional currents of the court, and watch the raw, screaming colors of the warp in all their horrifying glory. The world was no longer a place to be viewed, but a feast to be devoured with her gaze. As her body completed its horrific metamorphosis, her mind underwent a parallel unraveling. The memories of her past life, the cold marble of her studio, the scent of Serenity's jasmine air, the peace face of her mother, the hollow ache that had started it all began to fade. They did not vanish in a puff of smoke, but were carefully, meticulously unpicked, their emotional resonance siphoned away until they were nothing but dry, empty husks, like pages from a book written in a language she could no longer read. Elara, the artist, was being systematically erased. In her place, a new consciousness surged forth, a being of pure, insatiable hunger. It was not a hunger for food or power, but for experience. Every sensation, every emotion, every fleeting thought was a morsel to be consumed. The memory of pain was as delectable as the memory of pleasure. The echo of a scream was as sweet as a symphony. The desire to create was still there, but it was warped into a need to orchestrate sensation in others, to craft experiences of such exquisite intensity that they would become permanent fixtures in the endless tapestry of Slaanesh's realm. The pursuit of perfect beauty was over. It had been replaced by the pursuit of the perfect feeling, and she knew with a certainty that was her new foundation, that the most perfect feeling was always found at the razor's edge where agony and ecstasy became one. The transformation was complete. The being that had been Elara stood poised on her new slender limbs, her chitinous skin gleaming, her 6 eyes taking in the court with a cold, predatory interest. The last vestige of her mortal identity dissolved, a final silent sigh lost in the cacophony. She was a demonette now, a perfect instrument of Slaanesh's will. Her first impulse was not to think or to remember, but to act. A fresh, terrified soul had just been deposited at the edge of the writhing court, its fear a bright, delicious scent on the air. A smile, alluring and utterly merciless, touched her lips for the first time. The hunt and the art could now begin. The hunt was a symphony, and she was its most eager conductor. The fresh soul, a man whose mind still screamed with the memory of a world of solid things and simple fears, stumbled through the shimmering, shifting corridors. His terror was a perfume, thick and intoxicating, and she drank it in with every facet of her 6 eyes. She moved with a liquid grace her mortal form could never have achieved, her slender limbs carrying her in a silent, predatory ballet. She did not chase him. She herded him, allowing him glimpses of false sanctuaries, a quiet grove, a familiar room only to have them dissolve into new, personalized horrors as he drew near. She watched the hope die in his eyes each time, and the despair that replaced it was a vintage more exquisite than any she had ever tasted. This was her art now, the careful, deliberate orchestration of agony, each shattered hope, a note, each surge of fresh terror, a chord in the beautiful, breaking music of his damnation. She joined the endless revelry, not as a participant, but as a purveyor. The grand ballroom where she had once bled was now her gallery, and the new arrivals were her living marble. She learned to read the subtle tells of their souls, to identify their deepest desires and most secret shames. To the proud, she offered subjugation wrapped in the dyes of honor. To the loving, she presented betrayal, masquerading as devotion. She and her sisters would weave illusions so perfect, so tailored, that the mortals would walk willingly into the traps, their own hearts and minds providing the ropes that bound them. The moment of realization, when the beautiful lie cracked to reveal the horrific truth beneath, was the pinnacle of the art. It was a sensation so pure, so potent, that she would savor it for days, reliving the exquisite collapse of a spirit again and again. In a rare moment of stillness, between the screams of one symphony and the beginning of the next, she found herself at the edge of a quiet grotto. A pool of thick, opalescent liquid lay placid at its center, its surface reflecting the ever-shifting colors of the realm. She gazed into it, and a ghost stared back. It was a face from a forgotten dream, with soft, mortal skin and eyes that held only two deep pools of sorrow and longing. The face was framed by hair, the color of serenity's twilight, not the iridescent chitin that now crowned her own head. For a single, heart-stopping moment, a name echoed in the hollowed-out vault of her memory. Elara. It was a whisper from a drowned world, a flicker of a self that had been unmade. A violent, corrosive urge surged through her, an instinct so powerful it felt like a physical convulsion. It was a need to shatter the reflection, to drown the whisper, to consume and obliterate this fleeting, painful echo. A claw lashed out, slicing through the image, rippling the surface of the liquid pain. But as the pool stilled, the ghost was gone, and only her own flawless, monstrous visage remained, 6 eyes gleaming with cold hunger. The urge to indulge, to feel, to orchestrate new sensations, overwhelmed the two. Fleeting moment of dissonance. The ghost was nothing. The hunt was everything. The memory was a stale crust. The terror of the next soul was a feast. She turned from the pool, her slender form already tensing for the next performance. She knew with a certainty as deep as the foundations of this realm that this cycle of crafting pleasure and delivering pain would never end. There was no finale, no resolution, only an infinite variation on the theme of sensation. She was both artist and artifact, torturer and testament, forever woven into the fabric of this eternal dance. There was no escape, for the cage was no longer around her. It was within her, and she was forever, exquisitely trapped